โมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings to you all. In Buddhism we have this word panya, which is often translated as wisdom or understanding. And one of the ways the Buddha talked about panya is that it's a power, a strength of mind. And just like the other important qualities we develop in the Buddhist path, such as mindfulness, samadhi, effort, it needs to be trained. The wisdom faculty, our intelligence and our ability to look at the truth and examine the truth needs to be trained. In the beginning, we tend to get our wisdom understanding from others. So we listen to the words of the Buddha or we read them. And that's an important way to gather knowledge and understanding. But the Buddha pointed out this is still based on what we call sanya, perception, memory. And as we all know, memory is not always reliable. We forget things, even good things. We sometimes remember wrongly, or over time our memory gets swayed and becomes biased, or gets affected by different experiences we have, so it's not always 100% reliable. But most importantly, it's not yet powerful enough to cut off the causes of suffering in our mind, which is what real wisdom does and what defines wisdom. It's that knowledge, understanding or insight that cuts off, removes the causes of suffering from a human mind. That recognizes suffering, its cause, and cultivates the ability to know that in the present moment and remove the causes of suffering from our experience, greed, anger, delusion. So memory alone isn't enough. So the Buddha said we have to take what we've heard and learned and draw it inwards to our mind and to develop wisdom more deeply just through contemplation, thinking about the concepts, the ideas that we remember and learn, comparing our experience, looking, learning, coming to an internal understanding. But even then, it still tends to be based on the thinking mind, stringing together concepts and ideas which help us to understand things and also help to quieten the mind. But it's still not the wisdom that the Buddha was aiming at in his teachings for us to develop. He was encouraging us to develop what we call pavanamaya panya, wisdom based on cultivating the path, and particularly sati, sampajanya and samadhi, developing firmness of mind, stillness of mind, through the practice of meditation and just general mindfulness in all postures, to the point where that stillness, that inner knowing, inner awareness is really strong and clear. So that wisdom, the wisdom that can cut off mental defilements rooted in greed, anger and delusion, can arise and do its job and ultimately free the mind from suffering. So Luang Por Chah used to say over and over again, like, as you practice meditation, you're developing this ability to calm the mind by focusing it on an object such as the breath or recitation of the word Buddho. Bring your mind to a state of calm, stillness, brightness. And that's a necessary quality to develop in our practice. But he compared it to like putting a rock onto the grass of a lawn or a field. As long as the rock is there, then grass won't grow. It temporarily dies off. But whenever you lift up that rock, then the grass re-emerges, grows again. So the peace of what we call samatha and samadhi is temporary. The peace of wisdom that comes through true insight into what is the cause of suffering and then abandoning it, he said, is like just keeping the rock there all the time. The grass never re-emerges. It's not temporary, it's permanent. Permanent happiness by removing the causes of suffering. So it's got to be better. So ultimately wisdom is what brings us to the end of suffering. It's better than samadhi alone. It needs to be cultivated, just like mindfulness and samadhi. So we need to train ourselves in reflecting on the truth, examining the truth, and particularly for the ending of suffering. That's the goal. When you when you become a Buddhist monk, you begin this practice of training in wise reflection and using your wisdom faculty just by contemplating, wisely reflecting on very ordinary things like what we call the four requisites, the basic necessities of life that everyone in the world needs, whether you're a monk or a layperson. You need food. Without food we can't live. We need clothing, we need shelter, accommodation, and we need medicine for this when we're sick. Those are the basic necessities all humans need. And as a monk, you're training yourself just to know certain things about those four aspects of life. You know, what is enough? What is the right amount? What is the right attitude towards food, accommodation, clothing, shelter, and medicines? In developing a wise, skillful attitude towards these things, because they're basic necessities, the need to use them, depend on them, comes up every day. So the Buddha didn't say we should cut things off, not have accommodation or food. But he said wisely reflect as you use these things so that you don't get lost in them or lost in wrong views to do with them. So, sometimes we get wrong views, we think, all food is bad, and we go on diets or fast because we see somehow that food is an enemy. Or we go the other way and just want to indulge our seeking of pleasure and eat endlessly snacking, endlessly trying new things, new recipes, new kinds of food. The Buddha encouraged us to reflect wisely on how we use food, because it's something we do every day, to learn what is the right amount just to give us good health, strength, not to indulge in it, use it to overcome the weakness of the body, physical weakness that comes with hunger and so on. And the same with the other basic necessities of life. Use accommodation to protect yourself from the weather, That's the main reason we have accommodation, give you a place that's sort of safe, secure from the weather, secure from other people, give you some privacy, some seclusion. But that's really the purpose of it. Even whether you're in a castle or a tiny little hut, that ultimately is the purpose of accommodation, isn't it? And as a monk, you're just reflecting on that every day to help give you the right attitude towards these things. And if you are well supported, sometimes you get a lot. A lot of food sometimes is offered, or good accommodation. Well, there are causes for that, and that's good, useful. But not to indulge, or not to expect it, or not to attach to it, to see that it's impermanent, not self, and to learn what is the right amount to use with these things, even if they're offered in large amounts. Say as a monk, you often still just choose to live simply, just take enough food for a day. You only eat one meal a day, so you just take enough for the rest of the day, give you strength. Accommodation, you just use it enough just to have a place to meditate and rest. Clothing, we have our one set of robes, which we wear often till they just basically wear out, and then if we're lucky, we have new cloth available, we sew new robes and carry on. But we don't need many sets of robes or fashion or different kinds. We just have enough to keep us warm in the winter, protected, just for modesty and so on. And you learn to reflect in this way. So some monks are very ascetic and they can get by with very little. But it's not a competition, and it's not asceticism for the sake of it is not the purpose. It's just learning to live simply, reasonably with what's available, and not to waste, not to indulge. So also monks learn to share, so we often get given more than we need, so we share with others and try to look after the things we do have. But this applies to everyone in the world. It's part of life, learning what is the right amount. So if you have too little, if you say you're homeless or you're really struggling, no income, then of course to consider practicing meditation and other aspects of the Buddhist path might be quite challenging or difficult or impossible. So that's one thing we learn, we look around in the world, and the Buddha praised people who share what they have. If they have a lot of wealth, well, there are those people who maybe are struggling, well, to share and see what you can do for others within your means. Because if someone is really struggling, it's difficult for them to raise the level of their mind, say through meditation or other practices. Everyone in this world needs a basic level of security, food security, some kind of accommodation, medical care, and so on. These are basic human needs, so we try to help those who are lacking. And if we are fortunate and skilled and we can earn a lot of wealth and make it well, the Buddha would have encouraged us to make good use of it, because if you have a large amount of money or wealth, you can't in one lifetime use all that yourself, so why not share it with those who are less fortunate? How much you share, in what way, well, there's a lot of flexibility there, and it depends on you. But to see the value of that, supporting others who are less fortunate. So the Buddha encouraged us to practice basic kind of compassion, generosity, and to reflect on these things, even the most basic necessities, because every day we're using these things and we do need to think about them, our relationship to the material world. One reason also is because it becomes a great attachment for the mind. It can become indulgent, an obsession, to the point where we forget everything else. And we forget the other aspects of the path and the higher kinds, deeper kinds of happiness that come from the practice of letting go of the material world or our obsession with it, letting go of craving, wanting, and developing this inner stillness that comes from meditation. So we always have to be on the alert and reflecting on that, how we are maybe unwittingly, often it's unwittingly, unconsciously just attaching and getting obsessed with the material world. You know, we live in a consumer society. There's a lot of social pressure to always seek more wealth, get more, have more, and we often equate pleasure and happiness with having more money, more wealth. But often to the point where, you know, it just clogs up our mind and becomes an end in itself. And with that, we get a lot of suffering because, you know, material wealth is unreliable, doesn't last, degenerates, it's impermanent, subject to competition, subject to the ups and downs of the economy and so on. It's not a reliable, ultimately it's not a reliable source of happiness. It provides us with a lot of temporary comfort, but then that can be very deluding. I remember when I first came to Australia, one man came to visit us when we were living in a rented cabin with very little support, and we said, oh, we're here to build a monastery, start a monastery. And he was basically supportive in talking to us, but he said his life, he'd come to Australia also as an immigrant. He wasn't born here, so we had something in common. He said he always had his goal since he was a teenager was to get an education and get to university, and then get a university degree and then go out and earn money. And he said his goal up to a point was always just to earn his first million. And he was very happy to tell me that he'd achieved that. He'd earned his first $1 million. So I congratulated him and I said, what now? Because it didn't seem like a final goal in life just to earn $1 million, although it's an achievement. He said, now I want a second million. And I said, does that mean it's just going to go on like this? And he said, well, that's all I can see at the moment. Is just making my second million and maybe another few after that. And that's the trouble with life, isn't it? Particularly the material side of life, consumerism, the capitalist system. We tend to get on a treadmill of just always seeking to get the next amount of money, the next bit of investment. You've just got your basic necessities sorted out, which is all you really need to live as a human being, but then you want more, and your mind is restless and discontent, is always seeking more. And we have a lot of skills and intelligence as human beings, so that we can achieve that. We can achieve many goals and then we get new goals and on it goes. So very easy to become prey to what we call craving, tanha. And often without realizing, it just becomes an unconscious habit of mind, always thinking, what next? The next product to have, the next way to earn money, the next service, the next product we can produce, the next product we can consume, and we just go on like that. But as soon as you start practicing meditation, you notice this, don't you? You notice that restless mind that's always thinking, what can I get next? What do I need? So the Buddha encouraged us to really reflect on these things. Do I really need that next thing that my mind tells me I need? Is that really going to make me happy? And that's a valid question, and that's something we should bring up regularly. Examine how much we really need to live as a human being, what's extra or excess, what's really necessary. And this isn't to judge ourselves or judge others. You know, sometimes we start feeling guilty, or I've got too much, and then become self-critical, or we become critical of others. But really the Buddha was encouraging us to look at it in terms of our mind. How can we find inner peace and stillness? And obviously you have to learn to set aside the mind that's just wanting and grasping all the time, and judging, the judging mind as well. And that's where meditation is so useful. You're learning, just like we learn to understand how much we need in terms of material things, we reflect on that, how much food, accommodation, clothing and so on. How much do we need internally? How many different sense experiences, how many different thoughts and moods and views and opinions do we need to be happy? As you start practicing meditation, say practicing mindfulness of breathing, you realize, oh, you don't actually need that much to be happy. You can let go of many things and find happiness, the happiness of a peaceful mind. And sometimes the very letting go is where the peaceful, happy mind arises from. And you realize that we're carrying a lot of baggage, a lot of desire, wanting. As a monk, when you teach like this, then people always come up and say, oh, but you need ambition, you need to be motivated to get on in life. Well, yes, you do on one level, on the one hand, but you also need to be able to set aside the mind of grasping, wanting all the time. Otherwise, it never achieves any real inner peace. And that's where if we practice meditation, develop mindfulness, and some of the inner joy of letting go, then we get a whole new perspective on life. Some of our attitudes and opinions change as we practice. So if you have an inner source of happiness that comes from letting go of the mind that wants, doesn't want, likes, dislikes, it's endlessly thinking and planning and scheming. If you know how to let go of that, then you suddenly have this independent quality of inner happiness. It's a form of freedom, freedom from the slavery, the tyranny of the mind that's never satisfied. And this is where the practice of mindfulness, right effort, and development of samadhi really helps. Most importantly is the quieter, the stillness of the mind and the quietness of the mind we develop as we develop samadhi through meditation, is that then you can see things clearly and you can see the desiring mind for what it is, an endless source of suffering. But you need that stillness to provide a comparison and to be able to reflect back on your experience to see it clearly. It's a bit like when you go into somebody's house and you've never been there before, you're just going on an address, and you might have GPS in your car or you have the address in your head, but you're looking for a house number and you're driving along the street. If you drive too fast, you can't see the house numbers, so you'll miss it. You usually overshoot, don't you? You go too far. And you can't crawl along because everyone's driving behind you and they get upset if you drive too slowly. That's where craving comes into driving, doesn't it? So you need to slow down. Ideally, you just walk. If you can walk, maybe you can see the house numbers very easily, or drive very slowly. And our mind's the same. We need to slow down a bit in order to see the truth, with clarity, to see the way things are, to see the harm of craving and wanting, to see the suffering it causes. You need to slow down, and the slowing down process is slowing down on the outside. Well, sometimes we need to simplify things, restrain ourselves, just sit down quietly, contemplate and watch things, or do walking meditation, which is a very kind of simple restrained posture, so that you can see some of the movements of the mind. Because the stillness you're developing through mindfulness exposes movement. And really suffering and stress comes from all those movements of the mind that are so often uncontrolled and seemingly endless, just endless thinking, planning, wanting, desiring, wanting to get rid of. That's the suffering of the mind, but it's not really revealed yet until the mind starts to calm down and mindfulness is established. And that's why regular meditation helps to improve the mindfulness, the quality of being aware, the inner knowing, so you can see the movements of the mind and see what they do. So developing mindfulness and strong, continuous mindfulness helps this quality of developing wisdom through wise reflection on our experience. Because once you're mindful, then you can look at your thoughts, the craving, and say, oh, this is craving. Look at it. It's causing me suffering. What if I just set it down, put it down, put it aside? Don't keep picking up every thought, every desire. What if I wasn't to do that? You can see that and you can start examining the truth of the way things are. Oh, holding on to thoughts with craving, desire, causes me suffering. What if I put them down, let them go? And most people understand this. The more they practice meditation, bring out mindfulness, they can see, say, thoughts arising into their consciousness as they meditate. Whether it's thoughts about the past or the future, or just reactions to sense stimuli, hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, remembering. They can see thoughts, sense impressions arising into their mind the more mindfulness is established. When you see the arising of these things, you can also then follow them through and see the cessation of them. And you can reflect on that, and you gradually are developing what we call insight or panya, seeing the arising and ceasing of mental states, thoughts and feelings, seeing them for what they are, that they're not that real, in the sense they're not anything solid or substantial. And the more you do that, the more you get in the habit of developing this quality of inner reflection as the mind becomes calm, reflecting on things, letting go, simply by observing things arise and then pass away and go to cessation all by themselves. You don't really have to do anything other than watch and observe, but you have to support that practice of observation with your practice of mindfulness, effort and so on. But then you just watch the way things are, and you'll see a thought arise, pass away. There's a space, there's a gap, and then the next thought comes up. But the kind of monotony of arising and ceasing is not actually the cause of suffering if the mind has mindfulness, is calm, is steady. It's actually can be quite pleasant and enjoyable to see arising and ceasing of thoughts, whatever kind of thoughts they are, good or bad, interesting, boring, to do with work, to do with one's health, to do with the world, the universe. It can become quite enjoyable as the mind becomes steadier and more still, just to contemplate the arising and ceasing of different thoughts and moods. Because there's a purpose to it. The purpose is you're constantly developing this wisdom faculty that sees and knows the way things are. And the more experience we get in that, the less you have to think things through and work it all out and remember teachings and so on. The more you practice, the more you just know for yourself from your own experience, and you know that when you let go, the mind becomes peaceful. So little by little that wisdom faculty or power, the power of wisdom is developing to allow things to just fade away from your experience, but without, obviously going into a hypnotic trance or becoming dull or going to sleep. You're doing it consciously, mindfully, just letting go, and you're seeing the cleansing process that takes place then when you let go of attachments. You're cleansing your mind a little bit at that moment. You're seeing things clearly and you're letting go of the causes of suffering, rooted in greed, anger, delusion. And really the way wisdom develops in the practice is through the practice, through developing stillness, seeing things clearly, and doing that over and over again until the mind understands more and more the way things are. And it doesn't want to keep picking up those things it's let go of, because you can see you don't need to be happy. You don't need all this extra mental baggage to keep picking up every mental reaction of pleasure and displeasure, attraction, aversion, every thought of, every plan, every ambition, every wanting, desire, every desire, wanting this, wanting that. You don't need to pick it up. It may arise, but you can let it go. Ajahn Chah's way of teaching this was saying it's like you're sitting in a chair in your porch of your house or the entrance to your house. And there's one door, and any visitor who comes you can see because you're sitting on a chair. There's only one chair there, so the visitors who come, they can't sit down, and you just keep watching, and every visitor who comes in, there's nowhere to sit, so they have to go out again. just as in reality, if someone came to your house, you didn't give them a seat, well, after a while they'd probably leave. That sitting on the seat is this quality of mindfulness, and then the reflective mind, wisdom, that's functioning, observing what's going on as sense impressions and mental states and thoughts arise into your consciousness and then pass away. And you're seeing how, you see the process, how when mindfulness weakens a bit, you lose your mindfulness, you forget yourself. Then of course you can't develop wisdom at that moment because you get lost in a daydream or a train of thought. And very quickly your mind goes to a worse place, you could say, a lower place, a worse place, because you're lost in that daydream. There's no longer mindfulness or wisdom guiding your mind. So you end up maybe with a little bit of confusion. Suddenly you wake up, oh, I was lost in a daydream. Then you're back again with mindfulness. Or you become caught into a mood. If you, by association, you remember one thing and then another thing, suddenly you might find yourself irritated or angry, or back with desire, wanting something again, or bored and then restless and wanting, fantasizing about something you like or want. But you start to see the harm or the disadvantage of losing mindfulness. So then when you regain mindfulness, it's like, now I know what happens when I lose my mindfulness. And it motivates you to be a little bit more vigilant, try harder to bring up the mindfulness with your meditation object and maintain the ability to reflect on your experience, to keep sitting on that chair. And there may be many different visitors come and they all want to go on the chairs, or maybe there's a bit of competition for that chair between different sense impressions, memories, thoughts coming up. But your real aim is to sit on the chair and preserve your number one spot there on your chair, because it's the chair of your own mind. You're looking after your own mind. It's not that we owe anybody anything. You really owe to yourself to develop this quality of mindfulness and then wisdom, because that's what looks after human mind the best. So the Buddha said the real way to cut off stress and suffering from our experience is to develop this ability to observe and know experience as it is. And to keep doing that, obviously, we develop the calm and the happiness of a state of samadhi sometimes. So we put the rock onto the grass, but then we withdraw from that state, or we can't maintain it much of the time, so that the rock has come off, the grass regrows, the mental confusion, the suffering, the desires, they all return. So we want something that's more complete than simply a rock on the grass. We want to really uproot that grass so it never grows again. So we also have to keep contemplating. Another way, Ajahn Chah used to say, well, how do you develop wisdom? Well, if you're not sure what to do, well, direct your mind to contemplate this body and the relationship between the mind and the body. What is it that knows this physical body? It's the mind. How do we know it? Well, we know it through our senses, through recollection of the body, through feeling as well, feeling that's related to the body, even though feeling itself is a mental thing, pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain. But we can know the body through feeling. Visually we can know it, we can sense it. And you're investigating your own perception of your own body, what you call your own body. The Buddha, Luang Por Chah used to say, contemplate this body. Ask yourself questions. Is it really you? Examine it. Why is it when you cut your hair, you don't think anything more about that hair that falls to the floor? You sweep away. Or if a hair falls into your food, straight away you find it ugly and unpleasant. When the hair was on your head, you liked it. You style it, wash it, look after it. As soon as it's in your food, you're repulsed by it. If it goes on the floor when you cut it, or it falls out, what is the worst job in a bathroom other than cleaning the toilet? It's cleaning the plug hole of a shower or a bath, isn't it? Because it's full of hair, and if people say, "Oh, what a revolting job," but that hair came from you. You have to contemplate that. Train yourself to contemplate this physical body. And see, ultimately it's not a person, it's not you, it's a collection of physical elements. And by contemplating, developing this kind of wisdom, as the mind becomes still, it changes your relationship and your view, the way you view, your mind views this body. You're not trying to convince yourself you don't have a body, or you're not denying the fact there is a human body here, but it's that relationship, the sense of identification with it, or ownership. It changes through investigation. Seeing it as impermanent, seeing it as not self. Understanding that, the aging process, nobody likes the aging process, but it's actually totally normal, totally natural for the body to get older. And however much we try to cover it up and paint over it, decorate the body, it gets older every day. It's exposed to sickness every day, injury, sickness, infection, all kinds of illness every day, because that's what bodies do. And there's nobody who can control that. We do our best to live healthily, be hygienic and so on, but this body is vulnerable to illness, to injury, and one day it must die. This is where we contemplate and change the attitude to the body, so you're no longer obsessed with it, craving it, grasping at it with delusion. We now can look at it with mindfulness and wisely reflect on it and see it for the way it is. And that's peaceful. It brings peace to the mind. That wisdom brings you peace. This is what we call Bhavana Maya Panya, the peace that comes from a still mind that can accept the truth even about our attachment, identification with our own body. We can accept it's something that ultimately we have to let go of. We tend to think of wisdom as something you get from listening to a lot of lectures and talks, reading a lot of books, and of course that can be a great source of wisdom on one level, but the wisdom that's going to cut off suffering has to come inside through the peaceful mind, from mindfulness, from awareness. In the time of the Buddha, there were those monks who did study a lot, listen a lot, learned the suttas, listened to the Buddha, could remember them, explain them, and that can be a great thing, especially for teaching others, helping others. The more we do accumulate knowledge and wisdom from the world, we can do great things in this world. But the Buddha didn't praise that unless it came together with the wisdom that cut off the causes of suffering. And there were some monks who didn't have a lot of worldly wisdom. They didn't have much formal education, couldn't remember things very well, but they still had enough wisdom to cut off the causes of their suffering, cut off their attachment, their craving. And the Buddha pointed that out. True wisdom is that, seeing craving as the causing of suffering and abandoning it. And if you have a lot of knowledge of the world and can do that, good. If you have a little knowledge of the world, it's still good. If you can remove suffering from your mind, that's what we want as human beings. There were two brothers who were often quoted because they expressed these two different kinds of personality. One was very studious, became a monk. It's called Mahapandaka. And he could study, recite the suttas, chant. He was very capable, could teach people, he could organize things in the monastery that he lived in. So he was a very useful monk to have around, a very valued monk. And he became an arahant. So he had wisdom to teach others, great knowledge, but he also was able to teach himself. So he was a very complete monk. He had a younger brother, Jula Pandaka. Jula means small or younger, who wasn't so sharp, wasn't so wise, wasn't so well educated, didn't read a lot, didn't study a lot, couldn't do the chanting. So he was generally kind of disparaged as a pretty hopeless monk. You know, he couldn't remember more than a few lines, a few verses, or even a few words of the Buddha's teachings. So he was often sidelined and looked down on as a bit of a hopeless case, and he wasn't yet enlightened. Eventually his elder brother got so frustrated with him because he wouldn't learn, he couldn't study, his mind was just kind of stubborn and very slow-witted. They kicked him out of the monastery. He said, "You're hopeless." He was trying to stir him to practice and learn more. So they kicked him out of the monastery. He said, "Hopeless case, go away from here." He wasn't doing that out of cruelty. He was doing it as trying to kickstart his practice. So he let him go from the monastery. But then the Buddha, in his wisdom, saw that he had great potential still. So he said, "No, bring him back, bring him back. He's still got the chance to become enlightened. He's just slow, that's all." And it came to a head one day when a layman invited the Buddha and all the monks to go to his house for a meal. He had great faith and he wanted to invite everyone, all the monastics, over for a meal. And the elder brother, Mahapandika, arranged for everyone to go except for his younger brother. He wanted to teach him, you're not learning your chanting, you're not meditating very well, you haven't learned enough. You can stay in the monastery, you no need to go on this invitation into the town. So it's kept behind on his own. But the Buddha, again, out of compassion, asked where he was. When they got to the house, he said, "Well, where's Julapandika? He should be here for the meal as well." And they said, "Well, he's back at the monastery." So the Buddha said, "Oh, call him over, go and get him." So they sent someone to pick him up. He went to the monastery and he found 1,000 Julapandikas, 1,000 monks all looking the same. So he's confused. He said, 1,000 of you? I thought there was only one monk left in the monastery. He went back to the Buddha and said, "Oh, the monastery is not empty like I thought. I couldn't find Julapandika. I found 1,000 monks and they all look very similar. They all looked a bit like Julapandika, but I don't know which one is the real Julapandika." And the Buddha said, "Oh, go back and ask, who is Julapandika?" Ask the question. So he went back and the first monk he asked, suddenly all the others disappeared and it was just the one Julapandika. And the Buddha knew, he'd finally become enlightened. The way he'd become enlightened, the Buddha had given him a simple task to do while he was in the monastery on his own. He said, "Take this white cloth." It's a bit of pure white cloth that had been given to wipe the Buddha's feet when he came indoors from outside. He'd given it to Julapandika and he said, "Meditate on this. You don't need to learn a lot. Just be mindful, holding the cloth, just wipe it. As you wipe this cloth, contemplate the impermanence, the movement of your fingers wiping the cloth, and then notice how the grease, any little bits of dirt or sweat on your fingers will gradually stain the cloth and it will change from being white to a grey, dark colour. Just do that simple meditation mindfully. And because it was the Buddha who gave him this meditation, Julapandika had done this, and he very faithfully, mindfully, with great effort, kept wiping the cloth, being mindful of his hands, the movement of the hand, and observing the changing colour of the cloth and observing impermanence, how even a nice, beautiful piece of cloth gradually fades and becomes old, dirty. And that's the same for everything in this world. Your body, the beautiful things of this world all fade, don't they, with time? So he actually became enlightened doing that, became an arahant, and the Buddha knew that, so it was at that time that they came to collect him. And with his enlightenment he also gained what we call manomayiti. He had the ability to manifest his body as many times as he wanted. He could produce avatars, replicas of himself. So if he'd been alive today, they'd probably put him in a Hollywood movie. He'd be a superstar. But he could do that because he was enlightened. He had great samadhi and psychic powers with that. But they like to point this out. His one brother, very wise, learned, arahant, The younger brother, also very wise, an arahant, but with different qualities, different personalities. So the knowledge of the world is not necessarily a guarantee of enlightenment, or not having knowledge in the world, learning, is not necessarily a guarantee that you won't get enlightened, or it's not necessarily a limitation. True wisdom is the wisdom that sees the true nature of phenomena, see physical and mental phenomena as impermanent, as suffering, and as not self. And the more we can develop that insight into our experience of this body, this mind, our thoughts, our feelings, the wiser we become. And that's how the Buddha gauged wisdom, or measured wisdom. Whether you have the wisdom to keep your mind balanced, centered, equanimous in the midst of a world that is constantly changing, in the midst of a mind that is constantly experiencing different sense impressions, different thoughts, memories, feelings. Can you maintain that insight into impermanence and not self? Or do you keep grasping, keep attaching? That's our challenge. That's the challenge of the practice. And true wisdom is seeing that, seeing the impermanence of phenomena, seeing the lack of self in phenomena. So they said, those monks, they said when they saw their body as impermanent, it's like there's a separation between the mind that knows and the physical body. They still have a body, but the mind knows the body is impermanent. It's no longer lost or grasping at the body as a self, but knowing these four elements come together for a lifetime, and when that lifetime ends, they disband, they break up and go back to nature. That's the kind of wisdom you gain through practicing the Buddhist path, and it completely frees the mind from all grief, sadness, anger, all attachment. So maybe for tonight I'll just say this much and encourage you all to keep progressing with your practice.